Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review. I've been chatting for quite some time now to a number of different patrons about different streaming devices, different streaming solutions, and my experience up until recently was really only using the little Raspberry Pi I've got down here, which I'll talk about soon. And so my overall understanding of the benefits that different streaming products may or may not have had was relatively limited. And so when I had the chance to get my hands on 5 different streaming products and compare them all to one another, see how they all stacked up and seeing what sort of differences you could get, I was really excited to find out. So come with me now as we explore a whole range of affordable streaming options. Now before we get going, I do want to mention something really quickly, which is that I've started putting up gear for sale on my Patreon page. Initially, I give my patrons a couple of days of exclusive access and they get an extra discount on the final listing price. But if none of the patrons want it, it then goes public and it's available to any of you. So if you'd like to see what sort of gear I've got for sale, jump through the link down below over to the Patreon page and check out the options there. As I said, product listings do go live to the entire public world after a short period of exclusivity for patrons, so you don't have to be a patron in order to get some great deals there. As you can imagine, I have lots of different products come across my desk, and most of them I need to move on to make space for others and to help me afford to buy other gear to review. So it's a great way for you to get a bargain and to help me buy extra products so that I can respond to requests from viewers for specific gear for review. With that said, let's get on with the affordable streaming roundup. A couple of things I should mention before we get going here is that all of these streamers work in slightly different ways, and I'll talk through the options when we get to each streamer, but what I wanted to point out is that some of them are Roon capable, some of them aren't, some of them you need to run through a third-party app like say Volumio if you're on Android, some of them connect directly to Qobuz and Tidal, some of them don't, and Spotify too, so there's lots of different variations. I'll cover off what I can in here, but my main priority is to talk about any standout features, both good or bad, and also the overall sound quality. I have had to draw the line at going into absolute depth on every single product, or this would have been a 3-hour video. So I hope you'll understand that this is mostly focused on sound quality and standout features only. Everything else you will have to look elsewhere for. All of the testing for this video has been done with as consistent a setup as I could manage. And what that means is that they've all been running only with their stock power supplies. So I haven't tried to play around with linear power supplies because I didn't have suitable linear power supplies for all of these devices. In addition to that, I've used the same set of cables for all different devices, and in almost all cases, I'll specify when this changes, in almost all cases I've used exactly the same DAC. And that means that I've been using the shit Yggdrasil OG version for almost all these comparisons. And to make the connections, I've used a range of cables from Supra. The idea being that by using similar level cables across the board from the same manufacturer, I was going to get something close to comparability and consistency between the different types of interconnects. So I've used a Supra optical cable, a Supra AES EBU cable, and a Supra BNC cable, which I've adapted to the RCA split of connections when needed. And my comparison point for all of this was compared to my normal PC setup, which uses a JCAT USB card fitting a USB signal via a Curious Evolved USB cable down into the Iggy under my desk. And so the idea here is that my PC is set up as just a normal everyday workstation. It's used for video editing, for my client work, which is mostly desktop type things with Word and PowerPoint, Excel, etc. And so the only real audio tweaks I've made there is the JCAT card and the quality USB cable. The idea for me then was to see if buying any of these streamers could give me a significant improvement in sound quality, given that it's actually more convenient for me to stick with my PC. So I'd want a better quality sound from these in order to make it worth fiddling around and switching back and forth between different inputs. So obviously using these for music listening, using the PC for more editing and things like that. Is it worth the back and forth switching, or does the sound quality not improve enough? As I said before, from chatting away to patrons and other people on the channel, I expected some great things from some of these products. And so my key question coming in was, at what point of price does the benefit kick in where it's worth using one of these as your music source rather than a modest computer setup? I know that's a lot of introduction, but I wanted to make it really clear what my thought processes were and where I'm coming from for this review. And with all that said, let's get underway talking about these streamers. The first streamer I want to talk about is the Raspberry Pi here, running with a HiFiBerry DigiPro board. So the DigiPro is a little board that actually attaches to the top of a Raspberry Pi. In my case, this is a Raspberry Pi 3B, if I remember correctly. So it's not the most current Raspberry Pi, but it works the same as the current models in the sense that you take the hat, in this case the HiFiBerry DigiPro board, and you plug it onto the Raspberry Pi, you set up the software, and away you go. By the time you buy yourself a Raspberry Pi, the HiFiBerry hat, which is about $80 US, the case if you want one, power supply, etc., you're looking at somewhere between $200 and $300 US worth of equipment. So it's a very affordable product all in all. The HiFiBerry DigiPro board is designed as a digital output only. It doesn't do any digital to analog conversion, so you can't take an analog output. They've got a different board for that, which is a DAC board. So this one is entirely designed as a streamer to take signal from the network, whether it's Wi-Fi or LAN, I'll talk about that in a second, and send that out through a couple of digital outputs into your DAC. Now in stock form, the DigiPro comes with just optical and RCA SPDIF, but it does have sockets where you can solder on a BNC plug, and that's what I did. It's a very simple soldering process. I would say pretty much anybody can do it if you've got a soldering iron, some solder, and you can buy yourself a BNC plug. That's pretty much all you need to do. And so I'm going to be comparing this with the BNC connection because it is the optimal connection. But before we talk about the sound, let me talk about the pros and cons of this type of setup. First of all, as I've already covered, if you want maximum connection quality, you do need to do the soldering of the BNC connection. And what I mean by that is if you're happy to use optical, that's completely fine. Depending on the DAC, optical might be preferable. But if you are looking to use a coax cable, the RCA coax is never as good as BNC coax because of impedance mismatches. I'm not going to go to the technical details here because this video is going to be too long if I do, but just know that if you want the best possible coaxial connection, the ideal way to get that is from a BNC connection all the way through to another BNC connection. The cable itself is identical, it's just the connectors that change, but it does make a bit of a difference. Something else that's worth knowing with the Raspberry Pi setups, and this is going to be the same when we get to the Pi2AES soon, is that you do have to fiddle around a little bit with operating system stuff. You need to be able to download an appropriate operating system, flash it onto a micro USB card, insert it in the device, and make sure it's working. It's not difficult, there's lots of guides out there on how to do it, but it is a little bit fiddly. It's not just a straight plug and play setup. Another thing worth noting is that if you're looking for something sleek and sexy to have on your desk, this probably isn't it. It's a very basic looking unit. There's a couple of lights that come on to show you that it's powered up, but that's really all there is to it. On the flip side though, it's super compact, so you can easily hide it away if you want to. Depending on which Raspberry Pi board you're running the hat on, it may or may not have Wi-Fi. My Raspberry Pi 3 doesn't have Wi-Fi, so this is a wired connection only. And for this test, I've made everything wired just to keep it consistent. But if you do buy a Raspberry Pi 4, for instance, I believe it starts at, you can get Wi-Fi on board. So there is the potential to have a little Wi-Fi streaming endpoint right at your DAC if you want to, or you can run it wired like I have. The final thing I want to mention is that this can run as a Roon endpoint, and so that's how I've had this one set up. This is a Roon endpoint version, but you can do others which will do things like DLNA and other connectivity options. So recognizing that there's lots of variables going on here, let's keep things really simple and just talk about how it sounds. So I've tested this running the BNC output and the optical output versus my computer as I described before to see how it compared. One of my test tracks for this comparison was Burning Bridges by One Republic, specifically the acoustic version of this track. When I moved between my PC as kind of my reference point over to the optical coming out of the Raspberry Pi with the HiFiBerry DigiPro board, was a sound that came a bit closer, so the vocals came a bit closer to me, and I felt there was extra crispness in the sound, but in not such a good way. Things got a little bit overdone, so things like the guitar strums just got a bit too edgy. There was a little bit too much attack. It wasn't a huge shift, but it was less enjoyable to listen to overall than the computer setup. They weren't different enough that I would say the Raspberry Pi was absolutely worse or terrible. They were actually quite comparable, but I felt like there was maybe not quite as good of a signal coming from the HiFiBerry board's optical output when compared to the computer. Flipping then to the BNC input on the DAC, what I heard was a sound that stepped back away from me again and was much more comparable to the USB output from the computer. I still feel like the USB connection was maybe just a hint better than what I was hearing from the BNC, but it's worth keeping in mind here that I'm using a really top-end cable from the computer versus a moderately priced cable running from the Raspberry Pi into the Iggy. It's possible that if I use something like my Wave High Fidelity coaxial cable, it could potentially bring it on par or even slightly surpass the computer setup. And so I think that's worth taking into account here. The very budget Raspberry Pi with HiFiBerry DigiPro board is already on par with my computer, and it's much cheaper than the JCAT card and the USB cable I have in my computer. Having said that, I don't think it actually goes better than the computer, it just sits at about the same level. And so for me, it's probably not worth the hassle of flipping back and forth between different sources and outputs as I jump between different functions during my day. But it's interesting to see that if you're not looking to use your computer with the same DAC as the streamer can pretty easily be just as good as the big box that I've got over here on my desk, without spending anywhere near as much money. So for me, that's kind of a win for the streamers, but it's also kind of a draw in the sense that it's not better, it's just the same. And so my next step was to test an all-in-one pre-made streamer in the form of the Acrylic S50 Pro Plus. This one comes out of the box ready to use. It is more of a plug and play setup. Obviously you've got to go through a little bit of network setup if you want to use Wi-Fi and things like that, but generally speaking, it's pretty much ready to go. You plug in the power, you connect it to the network, and you've got yourself a streamer. The S50 Pro Plus offers you a few different connection options in the sense that it's got things like RCA outputs, so this will run as a preamp to a pair of active speakers, and I have used it in that format. It's okay, it's not the best sound I've heard, but it's a good solid option. For $220 odd, it's pretty solid for what it gives you. In addition to the analog RCA outputs, it also gives you a coaxial output and also an optical output. And to take things even further, it also gives you digital and analog inputs. So you could run this with a pair of active speakers and use it as both a streamer, but also an extra source input, say for a TV signal, or maybe you've got a turntable that you want to run into this. So it's a very powerful device. It's a great and versatile option at its price, but my emphasis for this review is very much on the streaming quality. As you can see from the antennas here, it does have Wi-Fi. It's also Bluetooth enabled, I should mention. And as I mentioned before, it's also got RJ45, and so all of my testing was wired for the purpose of this review. A couple of other things I should mention before we get to sound quality was that the app I found for the Acrylic a little bit hit and miss. It's easy enough to set up, that part of it went fine, but I found once it was set up, running my music through it got pretty clunky. I actually found I had much more luck running it through the Bubble P&P app on my Android phone, and that allowed me to easily and seamlessly send things like Cobas and Tidal straight to the Acrylic. Something else that you get with the Acrylic S50 Pro Plus that comes via its remote control is it does have basic tone controls, so you can increase treble, bass, and apply a general bass boost if you want to. So it's got a really big range of excellent features, usable features. It's got a decent app from a setup point of view, not so much from a playback point of view, but it does integrate seamlessly with other DLNA apps. And I should mention, I keep saying DLNA. If you're not familiar with DLNA, it is a form of communication with streaming type devices, and it allows you to run having, say, music on a server in your home, or you can take it from the internet through services like Spotify, Cobas, and Tidal. It allows you to connect those services or those servers with a product like the Acrylic here. And so generally in my testing, I've been using one of two options. One of them is Roon. If you're not familiar with Roon, that's a piece of software that you run on a computer somewhere in your house, and it allows you to serve all of your music out to what they call Roon endpoints, which are devices running software compatible with Roon. Things like the Raspberry Pis are Roon endpoints, and also the Volumio Primo that I'll get to can be a Roon endpoint, but the Acrylic isn't, so that's why I'm running that as DLNA. Ultimately though, they're just different ways of sending your music around, and it's going to depend on which system you want to use as to which is better or worse. So coming back specifically now to the Acrylic S50 Pro Plus, I fired it up to compare the quality of its RCA, coaxial output and optical output with my aforementioned PC setup. For this test, I was playing Too Much by Dave Matthews Band, and I found that the optical output from the Acrylic was a significant downgrade from the computer. It wasn't bad, but it was only about 85% of what I could get directly from the computer. There's an instrumental section in the middle of this track, and there's a good sense of space in the recording depending on the system, and I was impressed to hear that the Acrylic did still manage to produce some space. The baritone sax that comes towards the end of those instrumentals was still placed off to the side, out in a bit of space. It was still a good rendition. It just wasn't as spacious and wasn't as clean and clear as what I could get from the computer. Ultimately for me across the board, what I found with the Acrylic S50 Pro was that it's got great features, great functions, but its sound quality in general doesn't quite match other offerings. So if you're happy to do a bit of fiddling and playing around, and if you're not in need of things like digital inputs, analog inputs, Bluetooth, tone controls, if those things don't matter so much, I do think a basic Raspberry Pi with a HiFiBerry type hat on it could be a better choice than the Acrylic. But if you're looking for a budget streaming solution for a pair of simple speakers, maybe something like the Edifiers that I reviewed a little while ago, you just want to run a pair of those with a simple streaming box hidden away that you don't need to see, then I definitely think the Acrylic S50 Pro Plus is an interesting option. For pure sound quality though, it does fall a little bit short, and for me I would definitely go for the Raspberry Pi and DigiPro board before I went for the Acrylic on pure sound quality. And so having wrapped up my thoughts on the S50 Pro, I moved to the next most expensive option in the list, and that brings us to the next Raspberry Pi option, in this case the Pi2AES. Now I want to say a huge thanks before we get going on this to Snow Ranger, a channel patron, long-time viewer, who was kind enough to send me the Pi2AES. So thank you Snow Ranger for making this possible. It's been fantastic to compare this to the other devices, given the great reputation that the Pi2AES has. For those that are into things like the Pi2AES, I'll mention that it was running the Pi2AES software. I'm not sure if that's how you say it, but that was the software that Snow Ranger had running on it, and I kept it running that because it just worked well. I did have a few issues with it taking a lot of time to get synced up to the network whenever I powered it up, but once it was up and running, it worked beautifully. The total setup on something like a Pi2AES is going to come in at roughly $300 US. Now I'm being rough and vague about the pricing there because it does depend on the things you buy, such as cases, power supplies, the board and the Raspberry Pi part of that cost. So there's always going to be variation in the price of one of these units because there's lots of things that you can choose to do differently. So think of this as somewhere between say $300 and $400 US as a streaming device, which puts it anywhere up to about $150 US or so more than the HiFiBerry version, but it gives you a lot more options. The Pi2AES will output, as the name would suggest, AES. It also comes fitted with BNC, so there's no soldering and purchasing of BNC sockets like I had to do with my HiFiBerry. It's got a coaxial SPDIF output, it's got optical output, and it's also got an I2S output. And that was part of what I was most excited about, but I've got some bad news. I've got two devices here with I2S, and I couldn't get either of them to work effectively with the Topping D90 SE. It's probably a configuration issue, and if I had more time to tinker and play, I probably could have gotten them working, but I had to draw the line somewhere. After flipping through different options to try to get them to work, I eventually had to give up. And so ultimately, whilst there is a chance that I2S will sound even better than what I'm talking about here, all of my testing has been limited to only the other options. Before I tell you how it sounded though, let me talk about some of the pros and cons of the Pi2AES. First and foremost, you do need to fiddle around once again with flashing an operating system onto a micro SD card and getting it up and running. Just like with the HiFiBerry setup, anytime using a Raspberry Pi, there is that process. It gives you great versatility in which software you run and how it's set up, but it does require a little bit of time, following instructions, and having a little general sense of how to get things running. Once again, like the HiFiBerry setup, it's not the sleekest looking product, but once again, you can also easily hide it away because it's small and there's no buttons you need to touch. Once again, being a Raspberry Pi setup, it may or may not have Wi-Fi. This one happens to have Wi-Fi, but I still tested wired. One of the things I really like about the Pi2AES is it very easily lets you do things like power the Raspberry Pi and the Pi2AES separately, which theoretically can improve the sound. But for the sake of this testing, I kept things simple as I said before, so I was powering the entire Pi2AES through its single power socket. I didn't set it up to separate the two. I might do that in a separate video, but I can't promise it because I'm swamped at the moment with gear. And so I did this in its very most basic setup to see how comparable it was to what else I had on my desk without too much tweaking and fiddling. Starting with the optical connection once again, and that's just because it's the order that the Iggy runs in. Starting with the optical output coming from the PC USB output, I had some problems with the Pi2AES. I actually think maybe there's a cracked solder joint on the optical connection because it was coming and going if I wiggled the cable. So I didn't put any time and effort into the testing of that. When I did hear it briefly, the sound didn't sound great, but if there's a poor connection, that could be part of it. So unfortunately, I'm going to have to skip the optical comparison here because I can't give it a fair run. Moving on to the BNC and the AES connections. Because they're side by side on the Iggy, the first thing I did was kind of look at the two of them versus one another before comparing them back to the computer. The sound between the two was very similar overall, but I felt like the BNC connection from the Pi2AES was maybe just a tiny bit more open sounding. They were very comparable. It was absolutely splitting hairs at this point, but I felt like the BNC just sounded a tiny bit smoother and a tiny bit more open, whereas the AES had a sense of graininess or dryness to it. Very subtle, but I did feel like it was there. Now once again, the challenge here is that because we're using different cables for these, as much as I've tried to match the cables, it is possible that the interconnects are having some influence. That said, from what I was hearing based on the cables I have, I do think I would lean towards the BNC connection from the Pi2AES, at least in use with the Iggy OG. It could also be about the implementation of the inputs on the DAC. When I compared the BNC versus the USB from the computer, what I heard was a sound that was very comparable, but I feel like maybe the BNC from the Pi2AES was just a tiny bit better. It felt like there was a little bit more crispness and clarity in some of the notes, and the bass seemed a little bit smoother in the sense that it was maybe not quite as well defined and clarified as it was from the Pi2AES. Now the differences here are very subtle, so I don't want to overplay them or overstate them. It was to the point that maybe if I didn't need the convenience of having my computer as my sole source of audio, I might consider using the Pi2AES as my pure listening device, but it wasn't that far ahead that it's worth the inconvenience for me. I think given the time to explore and tweak the sound from the Pi2AES a bit more, maybe I would choose it over the computer setup, but I was surprised to find that the differences were fairly minimal. To put some arbitrary numbers to it, if the sound from my computer is maybe a 9 out of 10, I think the Pi2AES maybe takes it to a 9.3 out of 10. It's not a big step up, but it is a step up. It's enough that it's noticeable, but it's not enough for me to fiddle around switching sources all the time. Hopefully that makes sense. Oh, and by the way, for those of you that enjoy the track recommendations, I forgot to mention, one of the tracks I used for this test was Casanova by HiFiBerry. I won't put the graphic on screen for that one because we're going to keep moving, but Wild Swan by HiFiBerry is a brilliant album. I highly recommend it. For now though, let's wrap up the Pi2AES by saying that this was clearly, so far, the best performer. It wasn't miles ahead of the HiFiBerry option, which I believe has also been superseded now, so maybe the HiFiBerry has become more comparable to the Pi2AES. But I also believe that the designer of the Pi2AES is currently about to release or has just released a new version. So these things are always updating. I'll try to get my hands on some new ones in the future to share those with you as well. But for now, let's say the Pi2AES is currently the best option. It's just not far enough ahead of the computer for me as yet to make it replace it. But as a standalone streaming device, if you've got Roon in particular, the Pi2AES is an absolute winner. And so let's now look at our next option in the list, which is the SMSL SD-9. The SD-9 is a funny kind of device. I've reviewed it here on the channel before. I like a lot of things about it, and I really don't like some other things about it. Namely, the software is a bit buggy and a bit glitchy. Some of those things may or may not have been updated in firmware. I didn't think to check before this because I was only focused on sound quality. But if you want to know how this works, all of its different features, check out my separate review of the SD-9, because for the sake of this review, I'm only going to focus on things like the interconnect options that you've got and the sound quality itself. It's worth putting into context the fact though that this is a $400 device, making it about the same as a fully featured Pi2AES setup if you've got a really nice power supply, other bits and pieces. And in some ways the SD-9 is more versatile, and in other ways less. the Pi2AES can be a Roon endpoint, whereas the SD-9 can provide you direct playback, kind of like a transport if you've got a hard drive or a micro USB card of music connected to it, or as a DLNA music streamer. So you can run Tidal, Cobas, all that sort of stuff through this, but it's going to be from a separate app rather than from Roon. Let's take a quick look at the back, and then I'll talk through just a few more pros and cons. On the back of the SD-9, we've got a range of different connection options. We've got things like coaxial SPDIF, AES, optical of course, but we've also got I2S down here and USB sockets, which can take both an incoming signal from a computer, so this can work kind of like a digital converter. It can also take a hard drive full of music, as I've already mentioned, and or it can output USB digital signals to an external DAC. So there's plenty of versatility here. It is a very feature-rich device in lots of ways. My complaint when I reviewed it was more some of the glitchiness and the finickiness of the software, but it's impossible to question the number of features and options the SD-9 gives you. As I've already mentioned, I wasn't able to test the I2S, so in a moment I'll talk you through the different sound quality from the different outputs, but before we get there, I want to talk a little bit about a couple of the pros and cons over and above the things in my separate review. One thing worth noting is that the SMSL SD-9 is MQA capable. And what that means is that if you're streaming from Tidal and you want to make the most of the masters options on there, particularly when you're not given the choice, this will actually unfold MQA and output that MQA signal through the digital outputs into your DAC. So if you've got a DAC like the shit Yggdrasil that doesn't do MQA, this can actually unfold it and then send the unfolded MQA signal through to your DAC. It's also got a display, which means you can go through and tweak settings easily. You can see, depending on the services you're using, you can see album art. And I've already mentioned the ability to connect things like a micro SD card, there's a slot for that, and an OTG hard drive. So there's plenty of extra options there that you can use in the SD-9 if you want to do more than just stream. So with all that said, let's now talk about whether the SD-9's sound quality makes it worth putting up with a couple of the finicky things that I talked about in my separate review. Admittedly, in that original review, I didn't dive deep into sound quality because there was so much else to cover. But I have to say, in my testing here, the SD-9 really impressed me. One of the tracks I used for my testing was September Fields by Frazee Ford, and it was a really great listen from the SD-9, no matter which output I used. I felt like regardless of which output was coming out of the SD-9, jumping back and forth between my computer and the various outputs, the sound was consistently really strong. I think perhaps my computer had a very slightly richer, smoother sound without any loss of clarity or texture, so it was like it was actually just a slightly more refined sound, but it was very slight. The SD-9 really impressed me with how close it came to the sound of my computer setup. Regardless of which connection used, the sound of September Fields by Frazee Ford was consistently articulate and smooth. Her vocals had texture and air, but also richness and soul to them. There was a good sense of space in the recording. Everything was just really solid, and it's given me greater respect for the SD-9 as a result. I'd kind of written the SD-9 off a little bit because I prefer a Roon endpoint type setup and I found it a bit finicky. But to have this running in a DLNA system with either, as I said before, Media Center or running from an Android or an iPhone app, I think the SD-9 could be really great. As a separate test, I also tried the USB output of the SD-9 and it was equally once again just as good. I used the exact same Curious Evolved USB cable, comparing the PC and the SD-9, and running both sources into the TT2, it was very hard to split them. I was running the PC into the M scaler but bypassing the upsampling, and I felt like the PC had a slight edge in smoothness and general refinement, but I believe that even when you bypass upsampling, the M scaler might be doing a little bit of reclocking or something similar, and that could explain why the sound was just a touch smoother from the computer. Ultimately, I think the SD-9 is a really fantastic device from a sound quality point of view. So if that sounds interesting to you, if you like the idea of an all-in-one pre-bought setup, you don't have to fiddle with software and things like that, and you want lots of versatility of outputs and things like that, then do jump over and check out my separate SD-9 review to see if it's something you'd consider. And now that you can add my endorsement from here that the sound quality from the SD-9 is excellent, it suddenly becomes a slightly different ballgame with what I have to say about the SD-9 in terms of some of its foibles in its software. So check out that review if what I've said here about the sound is of interest on the SD-9. So let's park that one there and talk about the final contender, which is the Volumio Primo. The Primo is this little black box here, very nondescript. There's no lights, there's no buttons, there's no display. It's about as basic as it gets because it's meant to be hidden away. The Primo is a $565 device, making it easily the most expensive of the bunch here. On top of that $565, you realistically also have to take out a yearly subscription to the Volumio service. That works out to about $68 per year. I'm saying about for these prices because the prices are actually in euros on the Volumio website, but it means you're up for $565 plus $68 per year, or you can spend $765 up front for a lifetime membership, which is about equivalent to buying this and 3 years of the annual membership. So this is clearly the most expensive option of the bunch here. It's also in some ways the most versatile and in other ways the most limited. I'll explain more about that in a moment, but let's start with a tour of the back to give you a starting point as to why I'm saying that. On the back here, it's a very, very simple back panel. We've got a Wi-Fi antenna, we've got analog outputs RCA, we've then got a coaxial SPDIF output, an HDMI output, which is only for video, it's not for I2S or anything like that, a power socket, USB sockets, and then an RJ45 socket. So as you can see, very, very limited inputs and outputs. And in some ways that's a drawback of the Volumio Primo for me, but as you'll hear me say in a minute, there's a reason why I think this is an absolutely brilliant device. The first thing I want to talk about though are some of the pros and cons of the Primo outside of its sound quality. Firstly, its software is both fantastic and really annoying. When it's up and running, the Volumio Primo interface is absolutely brilliant. You can access it in a heartbeat through your web browser or through your phone. They've got their very own app. I'm assuming on iPhone, definitely on Android, which is what I use. And it's a wonderful user interface. When I said before that you really needed to sign up to the yearly membership or the lifetime membership, the reason I said that is that once you do, it also automatically integrates with Qobuz and Tidal and Spotify right through their own app. So it makes it a very seamless interface. What you can also do if you've got a membership is add plugins, and the plugin that I was most interested in was the one that makes this a Roon endpoint. The Primo can also do things like multi-channel playback, so you can link multiple Primos together in your system, so you can have multiple rooms running the same sources concurrently and in sync. It can also play back CD and rip CDs to a hard drive if you want to. I haven't tested that functionality, but I think it's brilliant that it's in there. And ultimately, I've just found it a real joy to use in almost all situations. My one big complaint with it is that every now and again, if I've had to depower it and then repower it somewhere else, or obviously when I was disconnecting and reconnecting things for this comparison, what I found was that I had to go through the setup process to reconnect it properly to the My Volumio service. And that was a bit frustrating because until I did that, I couldn't access the plugins, I couldn't access Qobuz and Tidal, so I had to kind of reinitialize the system on multiple occasions. For most people, and in my normal use of the Primo, it's not at all an issue, because what you do is you plug it in, you set it up, and you leave it going. Perhaps once in a blue moon, if you have a power outage, you might need to fiddle with it again, but in my experience, it's only been with the disconnections, reconnections, changing how it's connected to the network, that's when it's been a problem, not in general usage. Before I talk about the sound quality from this, I want to explain specifically why I'm so enamored with the Volumio Primo though, because it actually steps a little bit outside the purpose of this comparison. The reason I love the Primo so much is that the quality of sound from its RCA outputs is nothing short of excellent for the price. The only other device here that gives you that sort of functionality is the Acrylic S50 Pro Plus, and it really doesn't compare to the quality from the Primo, and nor should it. It's about a third of the price when you take into account the memberships that go with the Primo, but the Primo, in my opinion, justifies it the moment you hear the sound quality from the RCA outputs. What makes those RCA outputs particularly valuable is that if you pair them up with a set of nice active speakers, I've got a pair of Bang & Olufsen BLM3s that I use them with, when you pair it up with a set of nice speakers like that, you can also run an upsampling feature within the Volumio Primo software, and that's going to give you the ability to produce really outstanding sound quality from a very affordable, very compact streaming device. While I've been testing the Primo for this review, I swapped out the Primo and put in the Matrix Mini i3 Pro, which is significantly more expensive than the Primo, and honestly, I don't think the quality improved much, if at all, compared to the Primo. So from that point of view, I think it's an absolute winner. And I wanted to say that first and foremost, because what I'm going to tell you next gets a little bit fiddly. You see, one of the issues I've had with the Primo is that if you want to use it as a Roon endpoint, it won't work with the digital coaxial output. The only way I can get it to work as a Roon endpoint is if you run USB out of the Primo and into your DAC. Because most DACs only have one USB input, that means you then can't have your PC connected as well, which for me is an instant deal breaker. And so if I wanted to run the coaxial output from the Primo into the shit Yggdrasil, I had to use the app for that. And I then still had some problems with the coaxial output. So that part of it I'm not a huge fan of. It was a bit fiddly for me. But what I can say is that if you wanted to use the Primo with a USB connection into a DAC, so let's say you're in another part of the house, you want to use this as a Roon endpoint, this is a great option because the sound quality, which again you can actually upsample within the Primo, the sound quality of that upsampled audio coming out of the USB socket and into the DAC, it sounds almost as good, not quite as good, as something like my PC setup behind me. So if you don't want to go out there and buy a full-size PC and a dedicated USB card plus a linear power supply to drive that, then all of a sudden what you've got here is a really great option. Pop this in a cupboard, connect it up to your DAC, connect it to the network, whether it's wired or wireless, and you've got yourself a really fantastic setup. It can then be a Roon endpoint if you want to, or you can just go straight through the Volumio app and stream Cobras and Tidal. So for me, the Primo is a mixed bag. Sound quality wise, I think it is absolutely fantastic, but only within its limited space in which it can work. It doesn't have the versatility of something like the Pi2AES, or even in different ways, the SD-9 from SMSL. And so to bring all this to a close, and I know there's been a lot to digest here, so let me give you a quick summary to kind of close this all off. If you're looking for options that can be streamers feeding directly into a headphone amp or even a pair of active speakers, then what you're looking for is a Volumio Primo or the Acrylic S50 Pro Plus. Keep in mind the S50 Pro Plus doesn't sound as good as the Primo, but it's much cheaper. It's about a third of the price when you factor in the membership. The S50 Pro Plus isn't an exceptional option, but if you wanted to run this to an entry-level headphone amp and a nice pair of headphones, maybe something like the X-Duo TA26 that I reviewed recently, paired up with say a pair of HD6XX, the Acrylic S50 Pro Plus is going to do a great job. That said, if you want really audiophile sound to go to a pair of active speakers or a headphone amp, then I do think the Volumio Primo is the better choice. It's a fair outlay, but it's much cheaper than spending the money you'd need to on a computer, USB card, etc. So they're sort of your preamp options. I don't think either of these are particularly strong as a pure digital output option. I think you can do better. And in that regard, I think if you are looking for a pure digital output option, if you want to be running a Roon endpoint, then you've got two options in the HiFiBerry or in the Pi2AES. I found that the Pi2AES did squeak just a little bit ahead of the HiFiBerry on sound quality, but as I said before, I believe HiFiBerry already have a new version. It's called the DigiPro 2 if I remember correctly, and there's a good chance that that might have narrowed the gap. It still doesn't have the output versatility of the Pi2AES with all its different outputs, but sound quality wise, it's hard to go past either of these. And finally, if you don't need a Roon endpoint and you want something ready to go out of the box, then I actually think the SMSL SD-9 has climbed a number of rungs in my estimation. I've gone from not really liking it and planning to sell it to now questioning whether I should keep it. I do wish it was a Roon endpoint, but if you're happy to run DLNA, if you've got a home music server for instance, it can be absolutely fantastic. It's got lots of digital outputs, it can run USB output if you want to, and it can also be a transport for your music library if you've got a hard drive or a micro SD card that you can plug in. So all of these in my opinion have their place. If I had to pick one and only one to use, I think it would be the Pi2AES. I've just jumped back in to record this little insert because I got to the end, I've transferred all my files as you can see here, I've put my desk back in order, and I realized there's something really important that I forgot to tell you, and that is that I was actually surprised at how little impact streamers had compared to the PC. For ages now, I've been hearing people saying you shouldn't use a PC for audio, it's really poor quality, you can get much better sound with streamers, even basic streamers like some of the ones here, and my experience through this testing process is that it really isn't the case. In fact, in all of this testing, the only streamer that, in my opinion, was slightly better than my PC, and I'm talking slight, was the Pi2AES. Now I do recognise that my computer has a JCAT USB card, which is not cheap. A Matrix Element H would do a similar job for a little bit less money, and I'm also running a high-end USB cable, but at the same time, those small investments in my PC are going to stay with me for every computer I ever buy, and they also allow me the flexibility of using any PC source that I want out to my audiophile setup, whether that's gaming, whether that's editing videos, watching YouTube, watching movies, or of course listening to music. So I just want to jump in and make that clear. What this test showed me was that streamers can be great. They can be a very affordable and simple way of getting music in other locations in the house or separating it from your PC should you need to. But the idea that a streamer can significantly improve the sound way beyond what a PC can do at this level isn't the case. Yes, there can be incremental improvements with something like a Pi2AES. But realistically, it's not a huge leap forward, and if the convenience of computer audio is more preferable to you, you really shouldn't worry that you're missing out on too much. So I just wanted to jump back in and make that really clear. If you've avoided using a streamer because of the potential hassles, because of having to change inputs on your DAC all the time, then do rest assured you're not missing anything out, as long as you've taken a few steps to maximize what you're getting from your computer. If though the idea of buying a USB card for your computer and fiddling around with getting that set up is more hassle than it's worth, then streamers definitely have a place as a potentially quick and easy solution for better quality sound than a normal USB output on, say, a laptop or an off-the-shelf computer. So both paths do have their merits. I'm not suggesting one is better or worse than the other. It just comes down to what you're looking for. The key takeaway for me has been that you can get a PC system to easily match the level of these sorts of streamers. And if you've already got your PC, what you're investing in your USB card is roughly the same as what you'd invest in the streamers, and then cables all come down to your choice. What you would spend on an AES cable or an optical cable or a BNC cable is probably the same as what you might choose to spend on a USB cable. So realistically, take the cables out of it. The cost of these streaming devices to get to the same level of performance is roughly the same, maybe a little bit less than the cost of a USB card for your computer. So I think that's a better summary than what I recorded the first time around, and I hope that's made it clear. If you have found this review and comparison useful, I'd love it as always if you hit subscribe, ring the notification bell and hit the like button to tell me and YouTube that this is the type of video you want to see more of. For now though, let me leave it to the music and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.